One of the most difficult challenges facing the boards that oversee various kinds of endowment funds are resisting the demands placed on it by the institutions that it supports. Ultimately, it can be really hard to look at an account containing millions, perhaps even billions of dollars worth of an endowment and not want to use it to address today's pressing needs, particularly for administrators who won't be in charge several years from now when the full effects of fund depletion are being felt. Economist James Tobin remarked on the notion of managing endowments that the trustees of an endowment institution are the guardians of the future against the claims of the present. Their task is to preserve equity among generations. This is, of course, a complicated issue for various kinds of trusts to manage. For instance, an environmental trust, which only releases a particular amount of its capital every year, may find itself in a position of needing to make critical investments to protect certain kinds of waterways or species or ecosystems, lest there not be anything to protect in future generations. So it's always a challenging balancing act that managers and trustees face regarding how pressing current issues are that demand resources versus the kinds of issues that they'll need to set aside resources for in order to deal with in the future. Overall, a key focus for managers of any endowment fund is ultimately to try to preserve the amount of capital that has been provided, as any decline in the underlying asset base necessarily reduces future income potential. Effectively, the goal of any such endowment fund or trust should be permanent income, and that means trying to minimize costs, evaluating risks carefully, and of course, selecting the right kinds of specialist managers for each type of asset that the fund happens to invest in. Some of the other problems endowment funds run into, of course, are the high expenses associated with outsourced management, allocation-related conflicts of interests, needing to politically justify any sort of performance-based compensation. This is a particular problem at university endowments. And of course, the need for competent directors to oversee and to discipline any managers that have had, or any managers to whom we've outsourced resources. Another major problem that we face with trusts is that in most countries, there is a significant lack of transparency regarding the beneficiaries of a trust. Most of them are not required to reveal to authorities who their actual beneficiaries are, which of course can make it difficult to assess taxes that are owed. Now, in addition to that, there are the escape or flight clauses that I mentioned earlier, in which a trustee might actually be forced to seek a more favorable domicile if tax authorities begin to poke around and ask questions about who the beneficiaries of a particular trust might be. Now, there are some trusts which have been remarkably successful in supporting certain kinds of endowments. Some of these are literally centuries old, as in the case of religious endowments, and others are more modern. Perhaps the most famous endowment fund is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which was set up by the world's richest man, ultimately to channel his money into projects to help third world nations. A major supporter of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was Warren Buffett, at one point the second richest man in the world, who donated roughly $30 billion to the foundation, which is expected to ultimately defray most of both Gates's and Buffett's wealth throughout their lifetimes. The objective of these foundations is largely focused on third world nations because, as its founders and financiers point out, the problems in the first world, while they certainly exist, pale in comparison to the kinds of problems faced in the third world. And they ultimately feel that they will have a much greater impact, dollar for dollar, by trying to bring up the floor of the world's population, as opposed to necessarily trying to improve the lot of people who are already in some of the richest countries. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the ignominious Inca, which is the largest personal foundation by assets, but also by far one of the least generous. This was set up originally by IKEA's founder, largely for tax evasion purposes. Unfortunately for him, public outcry ultimately led the foundation to support children's causes as it had been originally intended to. But we've still to this day found that Inca is ultimately releasing far less in support for these causes than it generates from its asset base, effectively continuing to accumulate wealth within the foundation in a way that shelters its founder from any sort of taxation. But finally, as something between these two, we could also consider the Yale University Endowment Fund, which has been around for over 300 years. It was originally founded in 1718, and ultimately it's grown to become one of the most renowned endowment pools. Several centuries later, Harvard decided to copy the Yale Endowment Fund in order to manage its own burgeoning endowment. But it's worth noting that the Yale Fund was one of the very first endowments to ultimately invest in common equities, and it helped to set the kinds of portfolio rules that we use for modern day pension funds. So there's still a lot going on in the trust space, some of it nefarious, some of it obviously well-intentioned, but it's worth for us to consider a little bit more about certain kinds of endowments. So in our next videos, we'll be looking at one in particular, those kinds of endowment funds that are established by states for the benefit of all their citizens.